as we pivot or pirouette or start looking forward even more, it is clear, and somebody talked about this earlier, that we jumped on virtual learning, e-learning very early on. We've really embraced technology in the past couple of years, right? So as we look forward, Kathy, or as you think about the last couple of years, let's touch on this piece. What role is technology going to play going forward, and how should companies think about that? Because just because it's available in some cool platform doesn't necessarily mean that's the right way to do it, right? So thoughts?
Exactly. Like someone had mentioned previously, we've essentially been forced into the way that we're doing things right now, right? So I'm a total tech geek, so I love all the technology in terms of L&D or anything else. So even though we were forced into it, I think that it is something that should stay, and I think it'll become definitely more prevalent as we go forward, and that people are more comfortable using it just because we were forced to use it when potentially before you didn't really have to have that need to do it just because you didn't really have to. I think a lot of employees, actually, depending upon the type of training, prefer in person. And I think for some types of training, it is probably the right mechanism to use. So I think it'll be a hybrid. We're still going to end up doing in person. There's still obviously going to be on the job training. But in terms of technology, I think we're going to see a lot more of the virtual instructor-led training. It's going to reduce costs. You're not going to have to fly people potentially across provinces to go get training. More inclusive for individuals who can't travel as well. And then, the types of technology out there, and it was mentioned previously as well, you've got your base LMS, that's going to be your compliance, that's really L&D pushing courses out to employees. But then you've got like your learning experience platforms. So those are more like those ones that are now it's using more, AI in it and algorithms, and it's recommending things now. So I think there's also hybrid options as well. So you've got an LMS that has components of the experience platforms. I know someone had mentioned in the chat talking about a good thing to do it like discussion boards. So when we're talking about, going out and getting, let's say, formal training and bringing that back, you could use your LMS or use whatever platform that you have to have some forums where people can bring back those learnings, whether it's, leadership or whatever else. AI, there's so many things going on with AI, AR, VR, or artificial intelligence. I know that someone had mentioned about the acronyms to make sure that we say what they are.
Yeah.
So augmented reality, virtual reality, those types of things. There's a lot of companies getting into that space now, and it was at some point very expensive to get into. I think it's still pretty expensive to get into, but the costs are going down. So just making sure that you have that technology in place. If you've got multiple locations, you got to make sure that technology is available to every individual if you're going to be going more a technology route, right? But yeah, there's definitely a lot of interesting things coming out of that space. The artificial intelligence piece, I was reading an article just recently about a lot of them use it for scenario planning or scenario practices. And they have it to a point where the AI will look at your gestures of your face, and then it'll grade you on how you came across. Pretty interesting stuff, right? So yeah, so I think that technology is here to stay. It's just going to get better. I think it's from an efficiency standpoint for learning and development, I think it's a great thing to have, to look at the results and all those types of things for your organization and really figure out metrics on when or how things are working as well.
Yeah.
Excellent. I think there's. Oh, okay. Shane, and
sorry,
then
Kathy.
Amber.
Kathy, I think one of the things that you said there too is that's the technologies that are often in the public conversation, right? They're the stuff that's kind of bright and shiny right now. I think there's also a huge role that as we bring a bunch of these threads together and we think about how do I get the time for learning? How do I make it recognized? Like there's all these different pieces we kind of come to, right? And in some cases, one of the focus pieces that is really present for me in the last little while is how are we using some not that bright and shiny technologies, but using them for the right reasons and in the right ways. And one of the ones that comes to mind for me is how are we using pre-assessments when we're doing something like a virtual training or even assessing what do you need to go do from a learning perspective, and honoring the fact that maybe you acquired this knowledge somewhere else. Maybe you do already know even something like, you know, the annual safety training that just about every organization has to do, and having safety as a forefront in our culture is super important. We need that. And we need to recognize that I might have done WMIS at another organization. And so sitting through the WMIS course for this organization may not be all that good use of my time. And you do that 5 or 6 times over, and all of a sudden your annual training takes 10 hours. And that because we're not making the space, even for our mandatory stuff, people are doing that in their own time, and they start to, like, that starts to get grating, right? And people start to dread that. But how are we doing it where, if it is something where it's the assessment matters, like that's what I'm going to give you the check mark based on, if you will, or that's what I'm going to honor the learning based on. How am I doing more where I assess at the beginning? Can you pass it now? And if you can, go and be with, like, go have a good time, right? Rather than that idea that I think is still in a lot of our minds and a lot of our colleagues' minds about, no, they'll only know it if they sit through our version of it. And I think that's really that idea. And I love what Paula said there about like the Netflix translation to the TikTok thing, to that idea of we're all learning it from various places. We're Googling it. Like, if I can get the right answer, does it matter what I did to be able to get the right answer? And maybe in some cases it will, but I think for the vast majority of it doesn't. And we can be much more efficient with people's time and make learning less of a burden in that way.
What's coming up for me as I hear those comments is fit for purpose, right? Let's not get distracted by the shiny things. And there's a place for the metaverse in learning development. I don't know what that means just yet, but we're going to learn quickly. And then I'll go back and use my word before, humans. When do we need to have a human-to-human learning experience? When is it self-directed? And I think this is maybe an error or a trap that learning development professionals fall into. Well, we really like this one tool, and we go way deep on that one particular tool, and we start to lose sight of the learner in the center of all of that. And so how might we start user-centric, learner-centric, and build back so that it matches the organization's outcomes, right? How do, back to that ROI conversation, we need to tie learning outcomes to business outcomes. Learning enables business outcomes. It's not this little side hobby. And again, if you want to get, approval for dollars on investments for technology, you need a business case that you're going to, minimize headcount, reduce travel, as I think this is another thing that learning development professionals often forget, is that we are running a business within the business, and how can we use the language of the business to state our case, right? So that's what's coming up for me as I hear those comments.
Excellent.
For me, I'm going to jump in. I think for me, what comes back to, and I love all the fabulous technology and whatnot, but the one thing that I find it doesn't take into mind maybe fully is inclusive learning. So if I think about inclusive design for learning, where we are making sure that whatever we are designing, whether it's a safety course, whether it's a simulation, whatever it is it truly accessible to everybody? And so when we start to move into some of these higher technologies, we might have employees, and we do have employees that are actually out in the field that maybe aren't on technology anywhere near as much as the rest of us are, right? Or we even have, like, location doesn't really matter. But I worry that sometimes we jump on the bandwagon with these new shiny technologies. We spend the money because, it looks fantastic. It's engaging. However, somebody with different diverse needs actually might not be able to engage with it because it's the visuals, whatever it is, or because maybe that technology is it's too foreign for them. It's not something that they're used to. And we can build whatever we want, however we want, right? Even when we look at, we're going to do face-to-face, is it going to be synchronous, asynchronous? We can come up with whatever we want, but it has to be the right fit with the right tools for the right audience, and it has to be inclusive. And I feel like sometimes when we get too far down that technology road, it is not inclusive for somebody that needs to use text to speech or needs to use their keyboard to mouse or all those other pieces. And it becomes exclusive learning and not inclusive learning.
Yeah, really good point. Paula, you want to weigh in on this technology one too, as a final thought, and then I'm going to perhaps change up the next couple of minutes to get to some of the audience questions before we get to each of your final thoughts.
Absolutely. Yeah, probably the tech professional should actually weigh in on the tech conversation. But I would say that the thing that comes to mind for me, and I think what Nikki just said was really great. There's very shiny things, but if I can use the analogy of when I first learned to drive a car, if you gave me a Maserati, it probably wasn't going to go any better than if you gave me a tiny like beater like that was a Civic, right? And so if the only thing that really changes about the fundamentals is your attention to them. The fundamentals are always the fundamentals. And our brains, when Amber said about being human, like our brains haven't really changed dramatically in the last 100,000 of years. So, really designing, if you don't have that giant budget, that's okay. You can still do some incredible learning with like the cheap and cheerful tech. There's amazing things you can do with Slack. There's amazing things you can do with Zoom. We're doing it right now. These are not like super expensive technologies. There's also amazing things that you can do if you buy the Maserati. But I think that, be careful that you don't think the tool is going to fix the problem.